Thank you. Thank you very much, Pauline, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to present some of the work we've done here on wages in collective agreements. And let me jump straight to the next slide. So wage fixing and collective bargaining is part of the core of the functioning of the social dialogue. And it's probably one of the first things that you think about when you think about collective bargaining. So through collective bargaining, we can fix wages or wage floors for employees covered by a collective agreement. And actually the impact may actually be even larger, especially in cases in countries where extension clauses exist. So where the wages agreed in collective agreements are extended to all employees in a sector, or if other measures like the minimum wage are linked to the development of bargained wages, like is in the case in the Netherlands. Next slide. And there's actually surprisingly little that we know about what's in collective agreements about wages, despite how important this entire issue is. The actual text of collective agreements are rather a black box. And so we still wonder things like, how do collective agreements actually fix pay? And do they include wages? And if so, are these wage floors or pay scales? And how are these pay scales structured? And importantly, at what level are these collectively bargained wages set? Next slide. So in COLBAR-EUROPE, we looked at 602 collective bargaining agreements in Europe, which come from the construction sector, manufacturing, commerce, and the public sector. And the first thing we notice is that actually 97% of these collective bargaining agreements have at least one clause about wages. About a third actually fixed a wage floor, and 14% include the statutory minimum wage. Next slide. So the first thing we ask about is, what do these collective agreements say about the places where wages are determined? And we find that 28% of these collective bargaining agreements leave wages to individual contracts, whereas a quarter fixes wages at the company level and 40% at the sector level. Then importantly, 65% of collective bargaining agreements that we studied in this project included pay scales. Next slide. There are actually quite large differences between countries, sectors, and level of bargaining in terms of the inclusion of pay scales. So for example, over 80% of the collective bargaining agreements that we studied in Portugal, Switzerland, Poland, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and Austria contained pay scales. On the other hand, fewer than 20% of the agreements in Romania, the UK, Denmark, and Serbia did. And this is not to say that those agreements don't set or fix any wages, because it's quite common to fix just a wage floor. However, in these countries, we didn't find a lot of full buildings of pay scales, so to say. Next slide. We also find differences across sectors, finding that in the 4 sectors we studied, we most often found pay scales in the manufacturing collective bargaining agreements and least often in the public sector. And finally, looking at the level of bargaining, multi-employer collective bargaining agreements, and these are agreements that usually cover an entire sector or subsector, actually much more often contained pay scales than single employer collective bargaining agreements did, or so company agreements. Next slide. And so when an agreement formulates an entire pay scale, that means they also have to set different wages for different groups of workers. And most often, collective bargaining agreements that we studied did so by differentiating by job title or occupation. So if you work in a different job, you'll get the wage associated with that job. Other common distinctions that we found across the collective bargaining agreements were age, which were often youth minimum wage scales, subsector of economic activity, skill level, groups of worker, or tenure at the company. Next slide. Now, the next way that collective bargaining agreements can affect wages is by increasing them. And so we asked, how many of these agreements actually include negotiated wage increases. And we found that 13% contained a structural wage increase, a quarter actually only included a wage increase that was a once-only payment, and 37% contained a combination of both. However, 23% of the company and sector level agreements that we studied contained neither, so did not contain any wage increases. Next slide. So when we look at wage increases though, and look at these 395 agreements out of the 602 that contained a wage increase, we looked at how they do this. And about 2/3 fixed wage increases by a percentage increase. So let's say from the 1st of January, we all earn 3% more. The other third did something else. 12% increased the wages by a fixed amount. So for example, by the 1st of January, we all earn €100 more per month, and 21% did both. And that means that this last third, 33% of these agreements actually increased wages in a way that compresses wage inequality within the sector, simply because the fixed amount by which the wages increase is a larger percentage of wages at the bottom than at the top. Next slide. And finally, of course, we wanted to know the answer to a very crucial question: are collectively bargained wages decent wages? Are they living wages? And the European Union considers people to be at risk of poverty if they earn less than 60% of the median wage in their country. And so what we did is we compared the lowest pay scale that was agreed for adult workers in collective bargaining agreements, and we took the average of that for each country, compared it to the at risk of poverty thresholds. What we found is, on average, the lowest pay scales were negotiated above the poverty threshold for a single person. And that is to say, if you work in Europe in the lowest pay scale of your CBA, you likely earn enough to make a living for yourself. However, we also found that this was rarely the case for workers with a family. So the lowest collectively bargained wages rarely met the threshold for staying out of poverty for a family of 2 adults and 2 children. And so that is something that perhaps there is still work to be done. Thank you very much.